There's something hauntingly beautiful about the way civilizations whisper their final words, not with surrender, but with stories meant to outlast them. Picture this: an empire crumbles, cities fade into dust, but the myths it leaves behind, they refuse to die. Instead, they become seeds planted in the ruins, waiting to sprout anew in the minds of those who come after. This isn't just about endings, it's about the alchemy of myth, the way ancient cultures turned their collapses into something far more powerful, a beginning in disguise. From the ashes of Rome to the silent temples of the Maya, these civilizations didn't just vanish. They left behind narratives so potent, they reshaped the future. Think about the last time you faced an ending, a chapter closing, a dream shifting, and how it felt like the world might stop. Now imagine an entire culture staring down that abyss. What do they cling to? Not stone or gold, but stories. Myths became their lifelines, their way of saying, "We are not forgotten." When the Roman Empire fractured, its legends of rebirth and eternal cities lived on, inspiring medieval kingdoms and Renaissance thinkers. The Maya, as their cities were swallowed by jungles, left behind tales of cyclical time, assuring their descendants that darkness always gives way to light. These weren't just comforting lies, they were blueprints for survival, passed hand to hand across centuries. So why do these ancient stories still grip us today? Because they're not relics, they're mirrors. They show us how to face our own endings, big or small, with the same defiant creativity. When a civilization feels its time slipping away, it doesn't just document its history, it reimagines its future. And that's the magic we're about to uncover, how myths transform despair into hope, collapse into renewal. This journey isn't just about the past, it's about the stories we tell ourselves when the ground beneath us shakes. Ready to see how endings can become the most surprising beginnings of all? Let's begin. What's striking about the Aztecs' vision of cyclical destruction is how it transformed terror into expectation. When Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, ominous and unfamiliar, their myths didn't crumble. Instead, they adapted. The prophecy of Quetzalcoatl's return, once a distant legend, suddenly felt urgent. Here was the god-king, pale and bearded, arriving from the east as foretold. Even in catastrophe, their stories offered a script, a way to process the unthinkable. This wasn't denial, it was resilience in narrative form. Across the world, from Mesopotamia to the Andes, civilizations facing collapse did something remarkable. They weaponized their myths. Consider the Norse Ragnarök, a tale of gods battling monsters, of the world consumed by fire. At first glance, it sounds like pure doom, but look closer. After the ashes settle, the myth describes a new earth rising from the sea, lush and green. Two human survivors emerge, ready to repopulate the world. For Viking societies living on the edge of survival, this wasn't just a story, it was a promise. No matter how brutal the winter, spring always follows. Myths like these didn't just comfort people, they gave them agency. If destruction was inevitable, then rebirth was too. The Maya took this idea even further. Their long count calendar didn't simply track time, it framed existence as a series of renewals. When their cities were abandoned, when drought choked their fields, the message was clear: this had happened before. The world had ended and begun again multiple times. By embedding collapse into their cosmology, they normalized it. What might have felt like a unique tragedy became just another turn of the wheel. Today, we see echoes of this in how modern societies cope with crises. Climate change narratives, for instance, often pivot between warnings of apocalypse and calls for reinvention. The human mind still reaches for myths to bridge despair and hope. But here's the twist. These ancient stories didn't just help people endure collapse, they actively shaped what came next. Roman emperors, even as their empire fragmented, styled themselves as heirs to Augustus, weaving old myths of eternal Rome into new political realities. In Japan, the sun goddess Amaterasu's myth became a thread connecting fractured clans, eventually unifying a nation. Dying civilizations didn't passively leave behind tales. They launched narrative ships meant to sail into futures they'd never see. That's the real power of myth. It's not just about making peace with endings, it's about scripting the beginnings that follow. The phoenix isn't just a bird, it's a revolution in feathers. Ancient Egyptians watched the Nile flood and recede, crops wither and regrow, and they saw this cycle mirrored in the Bennu bird, their fiery precursor to the phoenix. Perched atop sacred obelisks, it wasn't just tied to Ra's daily journey across the sky. It was the sun itself, dying in crimson embers each evening only to blaze back to life at dawn. This wasn't poetic fancy, it was survival logic carved into mythology. When drought parched the land or dynasties fell, the Bennu whispered a radical idea: endings are just preludes. Then came the Greeks, who spun the tale even further. For them, the phoenix became a nomadic alchemist, gathering cinnamon and myrrh to build its own funeral pyre. But here's the genius twist. The bird doesn't just resurrect, it carries the ashes of its former self in an egg to Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Imagine the weight of that symbolism for a crumbling empire. It's not about erasing the past, it's about transforming it. When Alexander the Great's empire fragmented after his death, successor kingdoms clung to phoenix imagery on coins and banners, insisting their fractured realms were part of a grander rebirth. What makes the phoenix myth so universal isn't just its spectacle, it's the psychology beneath the flames. Civilizations facing collapse aren't just seeking comfort, they're engineering hope. The phoenix offered a narrative loophole. Destruction could be productive. Persian Zoroastrians wove it into their cosmic battle between light and darkness, while early Christians painted it in catacombs as proof of resurrection. Even in China, the fenghuang bird, often conflated with the phoenix, symbolized the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule that could pass from one dynasty to another. Different cultures, same story. Collapse isn't failure, it's fertilizer, and that's the real lesson humming in the phoenix's wings. These myths didn't just predict renewal, they demanded it. When Roman poets like Ovid described the phoenix, they weren't writing fantasy, they were scripting a survival manual for their civilization. Every time the bird appears in art or literature across dying empires, it's not nostalgia, it's a dare. The phoenix asks, if ash can become wings, what might your ruins become? The Norse didn't fear Ragnarok, they rehearsed it. Picture Viking longships cutting through icy fjords, their sails painted with scenes of wolves swallowing the sun and serpents churning the seas. These weren't just decorations, they were maps of the inevitable. When the Norse spoke of Ragnarok, they described it in vivid, almost clinical detail. The great wolf Fenrir breaking free, the world tree Yggdrasil trembling, brother turning on brother in final battles. But here's what most retellings miss: the catastrophe wasn't the end of the story. It was the necessary storm before the soil could renew. What made this myth so radical was its insistence on balance. For every loss Odin devoured, Thor poisoned, there was a gain. Two humans, Lif and Lifthrasir, would survive by hiding in the world tree's roots, emerging to repopulate a land where fields grew unsown. Even the gods weren't truly gone. Their sons would inherit the empty thrones of Asgard. This wasn't blind optimism. It was a cultural survival tactic forged in Scandinavia's brutal winters, where every harvest could be your last. The Vikings didn't just accept collapse, they ritualized it. Their sagas and feasts were rehearsals for the end, teaching people to face loss with their eyes wide open. Compare this to modern doomsday scenarios, where apocalypse is often framed as a full stop. The Norse flipped that script entirely. Their myths whispered a subversive truth. Destruction isn't the opposite of creation, it's its partner. Archaeologists find echoes of this belief in Viking burial sites, where graves are packed with seeds and tools, not just weapons. These weren't provisions for the afterlife, they were starter kits for whatever came next. And that's why Ragnarok still resonates today. It's not about the spectacle of ruin, it's about the quiet stubbornness of renewal. When climate change headlines scream of tipping points, or when personal crises make the future seem unlivable, the Norse answer lingers. Endings are never absolute. Their myths didn't just predict a new world, they demanded participation in building it. The survivors of Ragnarok weren't passive witnesses, they were gardeners in the ashes, planting what the old world had failed to grow. This cyclical vision bled into Viking daily life. Their explorers didn't just raid, they settled, adapting Roman irrigation techniques in Greenland and trading Arabic silver across continents. Even their rune stones, often erected as memorials, doubled as road signs for future generations. Everywhere you look, Norse culture embedded this idea. Collapse isn't failure unless you forget to plant the next seed. So when we read about Ragnarok now, we're not just decoding ancient poetry, we're inheriting a challenge to stare down our own looming winters and ask not, how do we stop the end? But what will we begin when it's over? The Maya didn't just tell time, they danced with it. While modern clocks tick forward in straight lines, their calendars spiraled, each revolution a chance to begin again. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Popol Vuh, their sacred text that reads like a manifesto for resilience. It doesn't start with creation, it starts with attempts at creation. The gods' first tries at making humans, clay figures that crumbled, wooden puppets with hollow hearts. Failure wasn't an ending, it was raw material for the next iteration. When drought withered Maya cities and political systems fractured, these stories weren't just metaphors, they were survival gear. Imagine standing in Tikal as reservoirs ran dry, watching your world unravel. The Popol Vuh whispers, this has happened before. In one cycle, arrogant rulers were punished when the hero twins tricked them into sacrificing themselves. In another, the gods sent floods to cleanse the earth. Each catastrophe was followed by a new dawn, not despite the destruction, but because of it. The Maya didn't just endure collapse, they mythologized it into a necessary reset. Archaeologists find proof of this mindset etched into stone. Take the famous, long-count calendar stele monuments marking not just dates but completions. When a Maya king celebrated the end of a 13-Bacton cycle, roughly 5,125 years, he wasn't predicting doom, he was staging a cosmic graduation. Even their ball game, often misinterpreted as mere sport, reenacted the hero twins' journey through the underworld, a ritual reminder that loss could be transformative. What's extraordinary is how this philosophy shaped their real-world choices. As classic Maya cities like Palenque and Capon were abandoned, their people didn't vanish. They migrated, carrying Popol Vuh stories like compasses. In the Yucatan, descendants built new centers like Chichen Itza, where the temple of Kukulkan's staircase casts a serpent shadow during equinoxes, a visual echo of the hero twins' celestial ascent. The message was clear: endings are illusions, time doesn't erase, it recycles. Today, Maya communities still plant milpa crops using ancestral cycles, rotating fields to mimic cosmic renewal. When linguists recorded elders speaking Kayich in the 20th century, they found the Popol Vuh's language alive, its metaphors woven into daily speech. That's the power of a myth that refuses linear time. It becomes a tool for navigating change. The Maya didn't just believe in renewal, they built civilizations to prove it. Rome's greatest trick wasn't conquering the world, it was convincing the world it could never truly die. Long before the Visigoths breached the city's gates in 410, Romans had already engineered their immortality through myth. Take the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus. This wasn't just a founding story, it was a psychological masterstroke. By rooting their origins in wild nature and divine fate, they ensured no political collapse could erase their identity. Even as the Western Empire fragmented, governors in crumbling provinces still minted coins with the wolf motif, whispering to citizens, "The bones may break, but the blood remains." Archaeologists find proof of this mythic stubbornness everywhere. In 5th century Britain, 1,000 miles from Rome and decades after imperial withdrawal, elites still buried their dead with mosaics of Aeneas fleeing Troy. Why? Because Virgil's epic had reframed destruction as heritage. When Aeneas carried his father from the burning city, he wasn't just saving a man, he was transplanting a civilization's soul. Centuries later, as Rome itself burned, that same narrative became a lifeline. Byzantine historians would later claim Constantine saw a vision of the cross with the words, "In this sign, conquer," but earlier accounts suggest he dreamed of Apollo, the same god who supposedly guided Aeneas. The myths didn't just adapt, they bridged collapses. What's fascinating is how these stories functioned as cultural time capsules. Roman engineers may have forgotten how to maintain aqueducts, but the myth of Jupiter's eagle predicting Rome's eternity. That lived on in medieval monasteries where monks copied Ovid's tales alongside scripture. When Charlemagne revived the imperial title in 800, he didn't just claim political power, he staged a mythic revival, dressing his paladins as Trojan heroes. Even the Renaissance, often framed as a rediscovery of Greek thought, pulsed with Roman mythic DNA. Botticelli didn't paint the birth of Venus because he'd unearthed an ancient text. He painted it because Rome's storytelling had never stopped circulating, flowing underground like the city's Cloaca Maxima sewers. The real genius lay in making eternity feel inevitable. While other empires boasted of invincible armies, Rome's poets wrote of a city without end, ordained by the fates. When Alaric's Goths sacked Rome in 410, Augustine of Hippo spun the disaster into the city of God, arguing that earthly collapses couldn't touch Rome's spiritual legacy. This wasn't consolation, it was mythic judo, using collapse to prove the story's truth. Modern parallels abound. Think of how eternal Rome rhetoric resurged when Mussolini drained the Pontine marshes, or how today's EU Parliament buildings echo Roman architecture. The empire fell 15 centuries ago, but its myths still whisper. Endings are optional when your stories know how to travel. Perhaps the ultimate proof lies in what archaeologists don't find. Amidst the ruins of Roman Londinium or Carthage, there's no evidence of mass despair inscriptions. Instead, they uncover amulets of fortuna, mosaic warnings about hubris, and tellingly countless votives to Mercury, god of transitions. These artifacts suggest a people who'd been prepared by their myths to navigate collapse as just another phase. When Romulus killed Remus over a wall dispute, the story acknowledged that Rome's birth was messy. So when its death proved equally chaotic, the framework already existed. The wolves, the twins, the wandering hero, these weren't relics of a golden age. They were survival tools sharpened over centuries, waiting in the cultural toolkit for the moment the concrete cracked. And when that moment came, they outbuilt the empire that forged them. Hindu scriptures don't describe time as a line. They see it as a spinning wheel, with each spoke marking an era of humanity's moral evolution. the four yugas unfold like seasons, from the Satya Yuga's golden age of truth to the Kali Yuga's age of discord, where virtue withers and chaos reigns. But here's the revelation buried in these ancient texts: the darker the age, the brighter the rebirth. When Muslim dynasties swept across northern India or colonial powers reshaped its coasts, these myths didn't just offer comfort, they provided a cosmic playbook for perseverance. Take the Mahabharata's climactic moment, when Krishna reveals the universe's cyclical nature to the warrior Arjuna. The epic wasn't merely recounting a battle, it was mapping the human experience onto a vast temporal canvas. Every war, every collapse was framed as part of a grander rhythm, one where destruction cleared space for Dharma's return. This belief wasn't abstract philosophy. It fueled real-world resilience. When the Gupta Empire fragmented in the 6th century, regional kingdoms didn't see disintegration as failure. Temple inscriptions from the era speak of the twilight of Kali Yuga, implying that renewal was already stirring beneath the surface. Archaeology reveals how deeply this mindset permeated daily life. Step wells across Rajasthan weren't just water sources. Their staircases descending into darkness mirrored the soul's journey through declining ages, only to ascend again. Festival traditions like Diwali, where lamps pierce the year's longest night, rehearse the same theme. Light persists because darkness is temporary. Even the churning of the ocean myth, where gods and demons collaborate to extract the nectar of immortality, encodes a radical idea: chaos itself can be harnessed to create something new. What sets the Yuga cycle apart is its refusal to vilify decline. Unlike apocalyptic traditions that paint end times as punishment, Hindu texts treat the Kali Yuga with startling pragmatism. The Vishnu Purana describes it matter-of-factly: rulers will grow greedy, families will fracture, but this very degradation makes spiritual liberation easier. By normalizing collapse as part of a divine curriculum, the myth removed its stigma. Historians note how this perspective helped communities adapt to upheavals, from the Delhi Sultanate's rise to the Maratha Confederacy's fall, without viewing themselves as failures. Modern India still breathes this cyclical wisdom. When environmentalists warn of ecological crisis, they invoke the concept of pralaya, not as doom, but as a call for realignment. Tech entrepreneurs in Bengaluru quote the Yuga cycle when discussing disruptive innovation, framing chaos as the soil for rebirth. The myths didn't just help a civilization survive invasions and famines, they taught that moral winters are inevitable, but so are the springs that follow. The wheel turns not to crush, but to reveal what each age needs most. The mandate of heaven wasn't just political propaganda, it was ancient China's operating system for renewal. Imagine a peasant in the Yellow River Valley, watching floodwaters swallow his crops for the 3rd straight year. When rumors spread that the emperor's concubines wore silk while villages starved, the myth offered more than anger, it provided a script. Heaven's favor had withdrawn. The dynasty's collapse wasn't tragedy, it was celestial housecleaning. This concept first crystallized during the Zhou dynasty's rise in 1046 BC. To justify overthrowing the Shang, Zhou rulers didn't just claim victory, they framed it as a cosmic realignment. The Shang had become corrupt, the gods sent droughts and rebellions as warnings. By the time the Zhou army arrived, the narrative was already set. This wasn't conquest, but the universe correcting itself. Archaeologists find evidence of this myth's power in oracle bones from the period, where scribes stopped asking Shang ancestors for guidance and began addressing heaven directly. What made the mandate revolutionary was its built-in obsolescence. Unlike Egypt's pharaohs or Japan's eternal imperial line, Chinese dynasties were meant to fall. The very ceremonies proclaiming a new emperor's divine right also planted seeds for his eventual replacement. Consider the Ming dynasty's collapse in 1644. When rebel armies breached Beijing's gates and the last emperor hanged himself, scholars didn't mourn the end of the world. They quoted Confucian texts about the vital force transferring to a worthier leader. Within months, the king framed their takeover not as invasion, but as heaven's will manifesting through Manchu virtue. The system's genius lay in its flexibility. Natural disasters became report cards on imperial performance. A 7th century Tang dynasty earthquake that killed thousands wasn't just geological, it was heaven's eyebrow raised in disapproval. Rebel leaders from the Yellow Turbans to the taping Heavenly Kingdom weaponized this, claiming floods and locusts as proof the current dynasty had flunked its celestial audit. Even foreign rulers like the Mongol Yuan dynasty adopted the framework, commissioning temples to the Jade Emperor to prove they hadn't just taken power, they'd earned it. Modern China still echoes this mythic logic. When 20th century reformers overthrew the king, they didn't reject the mandate, they rebooted it. Sun Yat-sen's speeches framed republicanism as the new cosmic order, while Mao's Little Red Book invoked the people as heaven's new voice. Today's anti-corruption campaigns, often timed with economic downturns, play like secularized versions of the old script. The names change, but the pattern holds. Collapse isn't failure, it's the universe hitting refresh. Perhaps the most telling artifacts are the 9 tripod cauldrons, ancient symbols of dynastic legitimacy. Though lost for millennia, their legend persists as cultural shorthand. Every time a new ruler claimed to have held the tripods, they weren't just seizing power, they were auditioning for a role in a story much bigger than themselves. That's the mandate's ultimate lesson. The best myths don't just survive collapses, they turn them into casting calls for what comes next. The Hopi don't measure time in years, they count worlds. According to their elders, we're living in the 4th iteration of existence, each previous world dissolved not by accident, but by necessity. These aren't doomsday prophecies, they're instruction manuals. When a Hopi elder describes the destruction of the Third World by flood, they'll point to the petroglyphs in Arizona's canyons showing spirals and migrations, not as records of loss, but as maps for the next emergence. What makes their perspective extraordinary is how collapse becomes sacred labor, like a potter breaking imperfect clay to start anew. Unlike apocalypse myths that focus on punishment, the Hopi tradition frames each transition as an evolutionary leap. The First World fell because people grew selfish, hoarding resources while ignoring spiritual balance. The Second collapsed when nations turned to war, forgetting their connection to the earth. The Third drowned in water, not just literal floods, but the flood of empty pleasures and distractions. Each ending carried the same lesson. When a world becomes too rigid to grow, it must shatter so something wiser can take root. Modern anthropologists note how these stories parallel actual migrations when droughts ravaged the ancestral Pueblones around 1100. The Hopi didn't see abandonment. They saw emergence unfolding. Petroglyphs at places like Betatakan tell this story in stone. A descending figure represents Masu, the guardian of death and rebirth, leading people through a sipapu, the symbolic portal between worlds. But here's what outsiders often miss. These carvings appear near springs and crop storage areas. The myths weren't abstract, they guided survival. When Spanish conquistadors arrived with horses and guns, the Hopi didn't resist with armies. They retreated to mesa tops, preserving seeds and ceremonies, treating invasion as another test of adaptability their prophecies had prepared them for. Today, that same philosophy shapes responses to climate change. On Third Mesa, farmers still plant drought-resistant varieties of corn using techniques passed down through collapses. During the 1990s, when uranium mining threatened sacred lands, elders didn't petition lawmakers, they released the Prophecy Rock teachings, showing how exploitation of Earth mirrored Third World mistakes. The message was clear: collapse isn't something to prevent, but something to navigate with intention. When a Hopi mother teaches her child the migration songs, she's not preserving folklore, she's equipping the next emergence. What Western thinkers might call resilience, the Hopi know as koyuniskatsi, a life out of balance correcting itself. Their prophecies don't predict doom, they reveal crossroads. The famous blue star sign marking the fifth world's approach, some interpret it as a supernova or planetary alignment, but elders whisper it's really about recognition. The moment humanity chooses between repeating old patterns or stepping through the next sapapu. Unlike Ragnarok's spectacle or the phoenix's flames, Hopi renewal happens quietly, in the space between a breath and the next, in the turning of a seed toward the light. The Celts didn't bury their dead, they sent them shopping. Across ancient bogs and riverbanks, archaeologists find cauldrons, combs, and even chariots placed carefully in graves, not as offerings to the void, but as supplies for a journey. This wasn't morbid ritual, it was practical packing for the otherworld, a realm so vibrant and close that the Irish described it as lying just beyond the ninth wave of the ocean. In Celtic myth, death wasn't an endpoint, it was a change of address. Take the story of Bran MacFebble, who sails to the Isle of Women after following a silver branch laden with white flowers. What's striking isn't just the island's abundance, where feasts never end and wounds heal instantly, but how casually Bran's crew transitions between worlds. When homesickness pulls them back to Ireland, centuries have passed on land, proving the otherworld doesn't obey mortal clocks. This fluidity shaped Celtic resilience during the Roman conquests. While legionnaires saw their victories as permanent, Celtic druids whispered of fallen warriors feasting in Magmel, the plain of honey, awaiting rebirth. A resistance fighter executed in Gaul might reappear in Welsh legend as a hero guiding the living through dreams. The otherworld's geography itself reveals how the Celts weaponized ambiguity. Some tales place it underground, accessible through burial mounds like Newgrange, where winter solstice light pierces the inner chamber like a doorway opening. Others describe it as a mirrorland just west of Ireland, visible at sunrise when the veil thins. This wasn't inconsistent storytelling, it was deliberate. By refusing to pin down the afterlife's location, the myths made it inescapable. Whether Roman swords or Christian missionaries came, the otherworld adapted, slipping between cracks in the invaders' worldviews. Festivals like Samhain crystallized this philosophy. When bonfires blazed on October 31st, it wasn't just to ward off spirits. The Celts believed the walls between worlds dissolved completely that night, allowing the dead to stroll among the living and share wisdom. Modern Halloween costumes, their distant echoes of disguises worn to blend in with visiting ancestors. The genius lay in framing what other cultures feared: the mingling of dead and alive, as an annual family reunion. Even the infamous bog bodies tell this story. Those eerily preserved Iron Age corpses, from Toland man to Lindo woman, weren't just victims of violence. Forensic analysis reveals many were carefully posed with last meals of blackberries or mistletoe, plants linked to otherworld passages. Their deaths, often during lunar eclipses or solstices, suggest ritual timing. To the Celts, these weren't sacrifices to appease gods, but couriers sent with messages woven into their very positioning. A body folded like a seed might symbolize rebirth. One with bound hands could represent the self-contained nature of the soul's journey. Christian missionaries arriving in Ireland expected to dismantle these pagan beliefs. Instead, they found themselves rewriting them, St. Patrick's legend of banishing snakes. It likely co-opted the druidic serpent symbol for cyclical time. The concept of purgatory, formally defined by the medieval church, bears uncanny resemblance to the Celtic Tir na and Og, where souls await their next phase. Even the Book of Kells, that jewel of Christian art, hides otherworld imagery in its spirals and knotwork, a proof that some myths refuse to die. They simply put on new robes. Today, this worldview pulses in unexpected places. When Irish farmers leave fairy trees standing alone in ploughed fields, or when Scottish builders divert roads around alleged elf mounds, they're not indulging superstition. They're acknowledging what their ancestors knew. Endings are illusions when the next world is just a breath away. The Celts didn't just believe in the other world. They built a civilization flexible enough to let it keep changing shape. And that may be the most enduring magic of all. Rebirth myths aren't just stories, they're psychological lifelines thrown across the chasm of despair. When a civilization feels its foundations crumbling, these narratives do something remarkable. They rewire the collective mind to perceive collapse not as a full stop, but as a comma. At their core, they address three primal human needs: hope, control, and legacy with the precision of ancient therapists. Consider the trauma of watching your world disappear. Crops fail, cities empty, familiar gods fall silent. Without a framework to make sense of the chaos, the psychological toll could be paralyzing. That's where rebirth myths intervene, offering what modern psychology might call cognitive reframing on an epic scale. Take the Babylonian New Year festival, Akitu, celebrated as far back as 2000 BCE. For 12 days, priests reenacted the creation epic Enuma Elish, not just to honor the gods, but to ritually dismantle and rebuild the cosmos itself. Tables were overturned, statues hidden, social hierarchies temporarily suspended. This wasn't mere pageantry, it was collective trauma therapy. By symbolically experiencing destruction and renewal annually, Babylonians inoculated themselves against the terror of actual collapse. When invaders eventually sacked their cities, the psychological groundwork was already laid. This wasn't the end, just another turn in the cycle. Modern studies of disaster survivors show similar patterns. Communities with strong cultural narratives about renewal recover faster psychologically than those without. The control aspect is equally fascinating. Rebirth myths don't just promise renewal, they often provide instructions for participating in it. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance, wasn't merely a guide to the afterlife. Its spells and rituals gave mourners active roles in ensuring their loved ones' rebirth, from placing amulets to reciting precise invocations. This sense of agency is crucial. Psychologists find that during crises, people who believe they can influence outcomes, even symbolically, experience less helplessness. When Roman citizens buried figurines of Osiris filled with grain, watching them sprout as the Nile rose, they weren't just observing nature's cycle. They were rehearsing their own capacity to nurture renewal. Legacy may be the most potent psychological salve of all. Rebirth myths assure the dying that their essence will outlast their material forms. The Zoroastrian concept of frashokrati, where the world undergoes a final purification and the dead are physically resurrected, transformed Persian funerary practices. Instead of elaborate tombs, they built towers of silence where bodies would be exposed to birds, accelerating natural decomposition as preparation for the coming renewal. This wasn't nihilism, it was radical trust in continuity. Contemporary grief research echoes this. Cultures with strong afterlife narratives show lower rates of prolonged grief disorder. The myth doesn't just comfort, it reorganizes how we process loss. What's extraordinary is how these ancient psychological tools anticipate modern therapeutic techniques. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches clients to reframe negative thoughts, exactly what rebirth myths do for entire civilizations. Narrative therapy helps people rewrite their life stories, precisely the function of myths like the Phoenix or Yuga cycles. Even the recent surge in post-traumatic growth research mirrors the old wisdom that collapse can fertilize transformation. The difference: today we have clinical studies. Our ancestors had stories that did the same work, not in labs, but around campfires and temple courtyards. This explains why rebirth motifs resurface during modern crises. After the 2004 tsunami, Andaman Islanders, whose origin myths tell of a great flood that cleansed the world, rebuilt with remarkable resilience. Their stories had pre-equipped them to interpret catastrophe as painful but purposeful. Similarly, Detroit's urban farming movement, rising from industrial collapse, unconsciously echoes the agricultural renewal rituals of ancient Mesopotamia. The human mind, it seems, keeps rediscovering the same psychological truths across millennia. When faced with endings, we don't just want comfort. We need stories that let us stand at the cliff's edge and whisper, with complete conviction, this is not the last page. Gilgamesh didn't just chase immortality, he built it with his bare hands. The world's oldest epic opens with a king terrorizing his city, a tyrant so consumed by power he forgets his people's suffering. But when the gods send wild Enkidu to humble him, the story takes a turn. Their friendship transforms Gilgamesh from a ruler obsessed with personal glory to a man haunted by a deeper question: how does anything last? After Enkidu's brutal death, Gilgamesh's grief sends him racing across the earth, not just to escape mortality, but to confront it. His journey isn't a failure, it's a masterclass in how civilizations turn panic into purpose. The moment that changes everything happens in a garden, not the lush paradise where Utnapishtim, the immortal flood survivor, tests Gilgamesh with sleeplessness. No, it's the humble orchard Gilgamesh plants after returning empty-handed to Uruk. The epic's closing lines don't mourn his inability to cheat death. Instead, they linger on the towering city walls he built, walls so magnificent, the mason still admires their joints. Here lies the revelation: eternity isn't about stopping time, it's about weaving yourself into its fabric. When archaeologists discovered Uruk's actual ruins, they found something astonishing. The very walls Gilgamesh supposedly constructed still bore inscriptions crediting him centuries after his death. The myth didn't preserve a king, it preserved an idea that legacy outlives flesh. What makes Gilgamesh's story so timeless is its brutal honesty. Unlike myths where heroes attain divine rewards, this one ends with a weary king kneeling by the Euphrates, washing the dust of his quest from his hair. Yet in that anticlimax lies its genius. Babylonian audiences hearing this epic during droughts or invasions didn't need fairy tales about beating death. They needed what Gilgamesh found: the realization that immortality wears many faces. A tree planted for shade long after you're gone. Laws carved into stone to guide future generations. Even the act of writing itself, the epic proudly notes how Gilgamesh's tale was etched on lapis lazuli tablets, ensuring his struggles would educate kings yet unborn. Modern parallels leap from the clay tablets. When tech founders talk about building cathedrals with their code, or artists describe their work as messages in bottles tossed to the future, they're channeling the same impulse. Gilgamesh's wall building mirrors today's climate scientists preserving seed vaults, or archivists digitizing languages on the brink of extinction. The tools change, but the human response remains. If we can't live forever, we'll create what does. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in what Gilgamesh almost misses. Racing home from Utnapishtim's island, he loses the magical rejuvenation plant to a serpent, a moment often framed as his ultimate defeat. But look closer. The snake's theft mirrors the god's earlier punishment of Enkidu, a reminder that death is nature's balance. By accepting this, Gilgamesh achieves something rarer than eternal life, wisdom. His final act isn't to rage against the dying light, but to walk his city's walls with pride, showing visitors where the foundations run deep. 4,000 years later, as archaeologists brush dust from those same walls, the paradox becomes clear. Gilgamesh's quest didn't fail. It just succeeded in ways he never imagined. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe still whisper secrets not in the languages of archaeologists, but in the voices of ancestors. Across Africa, oral traditions perform a kind of alchemy, turning stone walls and faded footprints into living conversations. When the Shona people walked away from their towering stone city in the 15th century, they didn't leave behind a graveyard. They left a classroom. Stories of Nyaminiami, the river spirit with the body of a snake and the head of a fish, didn't just explain the Zambezi's moods, they encoded survival strategies for droughts and floods. Ancestors here weren't relics, they were mentors, their wisdom carried in proverbs, drumbeats, and the call and response of village storytellers under baobab trees. What makes these traditions revolutionary is their fluidity. Unlike carved inscriptions that freeze history in one moment, African oral myths breathe and adapt. Take the Mali Empire's Sundiata epic. When griots recite the tale of the Lion King's rise, they're not just preserving 13th century history, they're updating it. Modern performances might weave in references to colonialism or climate change, proving the ancestors' guidance isn't locked in the past. Archaeologists find evidence of this in places like the Bandiagara escarpment, where Dogon villages have maintained the same architecture for 800 years, not because they resisted change, but because their creation myths taught them to build in harmony with shifting sands and seasonal winds. The ruins aren't failures, they're textbooks written in clay and thatch. The real magic lies in how these stories transform loss into continuity. When the kingdom of Mapungubwe faded in the 14th century, its gold artifacts and trade networks dissolved, but its myths migrated. The Venda people's legend of the Python god, whispered around firelight, kept alive the memory of sacred leadership and environmental stewardship long after the stone terraces were reclaimed by the Limpopo River. Today, when elders recount how the python's coils shaped the land, they're not describing geology, they're teaching resource management to children who have never seen the original kingdom. This ancestral dialogue takes physical form in rituals. The Yoruba Egungun festivals, where masked dancers embody the dead, aren't mere memorials, they're board meetings between generations. A dancer channeling a warrior ancestor might suddenly critique modern corruption through improvised verse, proving the dead remain shareholders in the living world. Similarly, the Xhosa practice of Ukuthetha speaking problems allowed to ancestors at designated rocks turns grief and uncertainty into collaborative problem solving. Psychologists studying these traditions note lower rates of prolonged grief disorder in these communities. The ancestors don't just comfort, they consult. Modern Africa still leans into this wisdom. When architects design Johannesburg's new buildings, some consult sangomas to ensure structures honor the land's unseen legacy. During the Ebola crisis, health workers partnered with griots to reframe containment measures as ancestral protection rituals. Even digital platforms now host virtual crawls, where diaspora youth connect with elders via apps that blend AI with oral tradition. The ruins may crumble, but the stories keep building, proving that in Africa, the most durable architecture was never made of stone. It was woven from words, passed hand to hand like a basket that never empties. Izanagi's spear dripped with primordial seawater long before Japan's islands had names. When he and Izanami stirred the ocean's depths, their brine-crusted blade didn't just land mass, it birthed a philosophy. Every whirlpool in their wake held a paradox, creation and destruction sharing the same tide. This isn't just a myth about how Japan appeared. It's a masterclass in how civilizations learn to dance with disaster. The Shinto origin story reads like a cosmic workshop. Izanagi and Izanami didn't simply will Japan into being, they crafted it through trial and error. Their first union, performed incorrectly, produced a leech child abandoned to the waves. Only after consulting older deities did they try again, this time with Izanami speaking first. The lesson: even gods need protocols when building worlds. Archaeologists see echoes of this mindset in Japan's earliest settlements. When Jomon-era villages were wiped out by tsunamis, survivors didn't flee inland, they rebuilt on elevated platforms, treating catastrophe as feedback rather than failure. But the real revelation comes when Izanami dies giving birth to fire. Izanagi's desperate journey to Yomi, the underworld, changes everything. His horrified retreat from her decaying form doesn't just spawn purification rituals, it establishes a template. By sealing the underworld with a boulder, he doesn't deny death, he contains it, creating a boundary the living can navigate. Modern seismologists note how this mirrors Japan's relationship with tectonic fury. From Edo-era earthquake charms to today's tsunami walls, the culture has always sought not to eliminate disaster, but to ritualize its boundaries. The myth's aftermath proves even grief can be alchemized. As Izanagi washes his face in remorse, the water droplets transform into new deities: Amaterasu, the sun goddess, from his left eye, Susanoo, the storm god, from his nose. Here lies the genius. Trauma doesn't just leave scars, it seeds renewal. When Mount Fuji erupted in 1707, merchants sold ashes as souvenirs, turning destruction into keepsakes. After the 1995 Kobe earthquake, survivors planted phoenix trees amid rubble, their roots threading through cracks like Izanagi's descendants. Contemporary Japan still moves to this ancient rhythm. The annual Ohari purification ceremony doesn't erase misfortunes, it symbolically casts them into rivers, trusting they'll fertilize what comes next. Disaster drills in schools teach children that preparedness is as sacred as any shrine visit. Even the way Shinto shrines are rebuilt every 20 years at Ai's Jingu isn't just preservation, it's active rehearsal for impermanence. The islands may have risen from a spear's drip, but their true power lies in teaching generations that every ending is a beginning in disguise. The Book of Revelation doesn't just describe the end, it architects a beginning. When medieval peasants huddled in plague-ravaged villages or watched crusaders trample their fields, John's vision of a new Jerusalem descending from heaven wasn't mere fantasy. It was radical urban planning for the soul. Picture the scene: golden streets, gates carved from pearls, a city where God will wipe every tear from their eyes. For societies teetering on collapse, this wasn't escapism. It was a blueprint for rebuilding their fractured world from the imagination outward. What's striking is how Revelation's imagery mirrored and subverted medieval realities. The 12 jeweled foundations of the New Jerusalem's walls, they echoed the crumbling fortifications of Constantinople, but transformed into something unassailable. The river of life flowing from God's throne, a direct counter to the polluted wells spreading typhoid in overcrowded cities. Even the absence of temples in John's vision carried coded defiance: no need for priests when every citizen walks in direct communion with the divine. Archaeologists find traces of this hope in unexpected places. Pilgrim badges excavated from London's Thames, each miniature Jerusalem worn smooth by fingers clinging to promise. The genius of this apocalyptic hope lay in its flexibility. When the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe, artists repainted the New Jerusalem with details tailored to their trauma, angelic physicians tending plague victims, heavenly banquets replacing famine-starved tables. In war-torn Bohemia, radical reformers like Jan, whose quoted revelations purified city to critique corrupt clergy, proving the vision could fuel revolution as easily as consolation. Even Dante's Divine Comedy, though not strictly apocalyptic, borrowed Revelation's architectural hope. His celestial rose a direct echo of John's jeweled metropolis. But here's what modern readers often miss. The New Jerusalem wasn't just a distant reward. Medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen treated it as an imminent reality. Her illuminated manuscripts depicted the city not as a far-off dream, but as a living organism, its foundations pulsing with divine energy, its walls breathing like living tissue. This wasn't passive waiting, it was active participation. When Cistercian monks designed their austere monasteries, they oriented cloisters to mirror the New Jerusalem's proportions, turning stone and mortar into rehearsals for paradise. The most fascinating evidence lies in how this myth shaped real-world resilience. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, Christopher Wren's rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral incorporated Revelation's measurements, its dome's height matching the New Jerusalem's described dimensions, Charlemagne's Palatine Chapel at Aachen. Its octagonal design deliberately mirrored John's heavenly city, making empire building a sacred act of anticipation. Even today, the hymn, Jerusalem the Golden, plays at British funerals and Labour rallies alike, proof that this medieval vision still scaffolds modern endurance. Perhaps the ultimate testament to Revelation's power is what it refused to depict. Unlike Norse Ragnarök or Maya cycles, John's apocalypse doesn't end with nature reclaiming ruins. His city comes down from heaven fully formed, a divine gentrification. This subtle detail made all the difference for collapsing societies. It taught them to build not just structures, but systems of justice, art, and community as down payments on the coming renewal. When a 13th-century stonemason carved Revelation symbols into a cathedral's facade, he wasn't decorating, he was drafting, and in that act, the myth became more than prophecy. It became a covenant that no collapse, no matter how total, gets the final word. The Inca didn't just witness earthquakes, they worshipped them as divine housekeepers. At the heart of their cosmology lay Pachacuti, a Quechua word meaning world reversal, where cataclysms weren't disasters but cosmic resets. Imagine standing in Cusco when the earth trembled. Instead of panic, priests would chant about the last Pachacuti, when the god Viracocha flooded the earth to cleanse it of rebellious giants. This wasn't mythology as metaphor, it was a survival algorithm encoded in stone and ritual. When Francisco Pizarro's cavalry clattered into the Andes in 1532, the Inca didn't interpret steel and smallpox as mere invasion. They saw the 9th Pachacuti unfolding a necessary storm that would, like all others, eventually restore balance. Chronicler Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala recorded how Atahualpa, even as Spanish ropes tightened around his wrists, spoke of this upheaval as temporary. His certainty wasn't delusion. It was the logical endpoint of a culture that had spent centuries building flexibility into its bedrock. The Coricancha temple's walls, engineered to sway during quakes, mirrored this philosophy. Bend, don't break, for the world always rights itself. Archaeologists find proof of this mindset in abandoned tambos way stations along the Inca road system. After the conquest, many were repurposed by rebels not as forts, but as time capsules. Hidden caches contained not weapons, but quipus knotted cords recording histories and miniature statues of Viracocha, as if waiting for the next cycle to begin. Even Machu Picchu's hitching post of the sun wasn't just a calendar. Its Intihuatana stone, precisely angled to catch solstice light, symbolized the Inca's ultimate faith. No matter how dark the night, the sun would always find its way back. Modern Quechua communities still measure time in Pachacuti increments, interpreting political upheavals and climate shifts through this ancient lens. When glaciers retreat on Mount Orsangate, elders don't mourn. They prepare ceremonies for the water's return in the next cycle. This perspective transforms resilience from gritted teeth endurance into something more profound, active participation in the universe's rhythm. The Spanish may have shattered an empire, but the myth outmaneuvered history, whispering across generations that conquests, like earthquakes, are just the world turning in its sleep. The alchemist's workshop smelled of sulfur and desperation, charred crucibles, mercury swirling in glass flasks, cryptic symbols scratched into parchment. But beneath the quest to turn lead into gold pulsed a deeper longing to cheat entropy itself. The philosopher's stone wasn't just a recipe for wealth, it was medieval Europe's boldest metaphor for resurrection. When cities crumbled under plague and war, these proto-scientists didn't just document decay, they plotted its reversal, one alembic at a time. Take the Emerald Tablet's famous axiom, as above, so below. On its surface, it's about cosmic symmetry, but in a famine-struck village, those words became a lifeline. If the stars could renew themselves season after season, why not a withered crop? Why not a soul? Alchemists like Paracelsus didn't just mix chemicals, they performed narrative surgery on reality, grafting the logic of myth onto material science. Their illustrations teem with Ouroboros' serpents, creatures eating their own tails, not as decorative flourishes, but as working diagrams for cyclical renewal. This symbolism didn't vanish with the Enlightenment, it shapeshifted. Harry Potter's Sorcerer's Stone, guarding Nicholas Flamel's Immortality elixir, is the most obvious heir. But look deeper. Modern chemistry's periodic table owes its structure to alchemical elemental triads, the recycling symbol, a twisted Ouroboros for the industrial age. Even the tech world's obsession with disruption and pivots carries alchemical echoes. Today's startups don't seek literal gold, but they chase the same mythic transformation, turning failed apps into unicorns through sheer narrative alchemy. The real philosopher's stone was never a physical object. It was the stories that survived when laboratories burned. When the Black Death erased half of Europe, alchemical texts resurfaced in monasteries, their coded language offering solace. Death was just the nigredo phase, putrefaction before purification. Jung would later call this the shadow work of the psyche, but 14th century adepts were already living it, painting their despair black so the next rebirth could gleam brighter. Nowhere is this legacy more vivid than in the stained glass of Saint Chapelle, where biblical scenes mingle with alchemical suns and moons. The artisans knew their audience, kings who'd lost heirs to war, merchants bankrupted by failed harvests. The glass didn't just tell Bible stories, it performed light's ultimate alchemy, transmuting grief into radiance. Today, when scientists manipulate atoms or AI engineers train neural networks, they're still chasing that medieval dream, not of avoiding endings, but of mastering the art of beginning again. The crucibles have been replaced by silicon wafers, but the oldest question remains. If lead can dream of being gold, what might our ruins become? The songlines of Australia don't just map the land, they are the land, vibrating through every rustling eucalyptus leaf and ripple in red desert sand. For Aboriginal peoples, the dream time isn't some distant past. It's the living pulse beneath their feet, where ancestral beings like the rainbow serpent still move through the cracks in reality. When a Walpiri elder points to Uluru and speaks of Kunia, the Python woman's journey, She's not recounting folklore, she's reading the world's original blueprint, etched in stone and star patterns long before surveyors' borders existed. This cyclical vision of time became an unbreakable thread during colonization storms. While European settlers saw empty wilderness to claim, Aboriginal communities recognized the land as an ongoing conversation. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land watched missionaries build churches on sacred sites, but their creation stories didn't vanish. They adapted, with bark paintings depicting Jesus alongside Jankawu sisters who birthed the first clans. Archaeologists find proof of this resilience in ochre pigments preserved in rock shelters. The same symbols used for 40,000 years in ceremonies now revived in urban art cooperatives. The Dreamtime didn't resist change. It absorbed history like monsoon rain into thirsty earth. What outsiders often miss is the pragmatic genius woven into these myths. The Luritja people's tale of the Seven Sisters isn't just a celestial romance, it's a desert survival manual. As the sisters flee across the night sky, their path mirrors seasonal routes to waterholes and bush tucker groves. During the brutal assimilation era, when children were stolen from families, these stories became covert maps whispered between generations. A grandmother describing the honey ant ancestors' trail might actually be guiding her granddaughter to hidden food sources beyond mission fences. The Jarowair people's fire management rituals reveal another layer. Their legends tell of ancestors who taught controlled burning to regenerate the land, a practice modern science now confirms prevents catastrophic wildfires. When colonial authorities banned these primitive methods in the 1930s, elders didn't protest outright. They simply adjusted the Dreamtime narratives, emphasizing how the fire ancestor punished those who neglected proper burning. Within decades, the resulting infernos proved their point, and today, traditional fire practices are being revived by national parks. Perhaps the most profound evidence lies in contemporary Aboriginal art. Dot paintings from the Western Desert might look abstract to outsiders, but every swirl represents ancestral movements across the land. When Emily came Kayengwa, I painted her monumental Big Yam Dreaming. She wasn't just creating art, she was reactivating the Dreamtime itself, her brushstrokes echoing the Yam ancestors' underground journey. Galleries call it surrealism, her community calls it documentation. Nowhere is this eternal return more visceral than in initiation ceremonies. At a Tiwi Island's funeral, the Pukumani poles carved with ancestral figures aren't memorials, they're portals. As dancers embody the dead, time folds in on itself. The mourned one rejoins the dreaming even as their spirit prepares to return in a newborn's first cry. Anthropologists recording these rituals note something startling. Grief here isn't linear. It spirals with sorrow and celebration orbiting each other like the ancestral beings who never truly leave. This mythic elasticity now fuels cultural reclamation. When the Noongar people won native title over Perth in 2015, they didn't just cite legal precedent, they summoned the Woggle, the serpent ancestor whose waters still flow beneath the city's concrete. Urban Aboriginal kids who have never seen their ancestral country learn creation stories through augmented reality apps that overlay ancient songlines onto subway maps. The Dreamtime didn't survive modernity by staying frozen. It proved what elders always knew: endings are just the land breathing in before it sings again. Fury Road's chrome-painted war rigs roaring across the wasteland might seem worlds away from Babylonian flood myths, but peel back the diesel fumes and you'll find the same ancient heartbeat. Modern dystopias like Mad Max or The Walking Dead aren't just entertainment. They're myth-making in leather and steel, rehearsing the oldest human question: how do we rebuild when everything burns? George Miller didn't invent the idea of a scarred hero navigating societal wreckage. He plugged into a narrative tradition as old as Gilgamesh wrestling with mortality in the ruins of Uruk. What's fascinating is how these stories tweak the formula. Ancient myths often leaned on divine intervention gods, sending floods or fiery chariots to reset the world. But in Children of Men or Station 11, renewal hinges on human choices. A bureaucrat shielding the last pregnant woman, a theater troupe performing Shakespeare in the ashes. This shift reflects our modern anxiety and hope that salvation won't come from Olympus or heaven, but from the stubborn kindness of ordinary people. Archaeologists might someday unearth our pandemic-era balcony concerts and graffiti murals as proof we were whispering the same truth as the Maya: culture doesn't die. It migrates. Then there's Star Trek, where apocalypse is a stepping stone. The franchise's oft-cited, post-scarcity Earth emerged from the rubble of World War III, a direct echo of Norse mythology's green world rising after Ragnarok. But Roddenberry's genius was making the Rebirth collaborative. Vulcans didn't hand humanity a golden age. They offered a hand up, mirroring how indigenous creation stories often feature ancestor species teaching survival skills. The message, collapse isn't just survived, it's learned from. Even zombie narratives, for all their gore, are secretly optimistic. The Last of Us isn't really about infected monsters. It's about rediscovering love in a broken world, much like the Celtic otherworld myths where souls find new purpose after death. When Joel chooses to save Ellie, he's not defying destiny. He's rewriting it, just as the phoenix gathers its own ashes. The real magic lies in how these stories shape real-world resilience. After Hurricane Katrina, survivors described their rebuilding in terms ripped from Waterworld and Snowpiercer, not as fiction but as frameworks. Climate activists now use Dune's Arrakis as a parable for water scarcity, while tech billionaires mine foundation for strategies to hedge civilizational risk. Our screens might show crumbling cities, but the subtext is clear. We're still that shivering tribe around the fire, turning our fears into blueprints. The sets are shinier, but the spells the same. Endings are just prologues in disguise. Plato never saw Atlantis, and that's exactly why it still captivates us. When the philosopher described an advanced island kingdom swallowed by the sea in two of his dialogues, he wasn't recording history. He was crafting a thought experiment about hubris, a warning wrapped in waves and marble columns. Yet 24 centuries later, we're still combing ocean floors and satellite images, convinced the myth must be more than metaphor. That's the alchemy of Atlantis, a story designed to vanish that refuses to die. The genius lies in how Plato built oblivion into the tale. Atlantis wasn't just destroyed, it was erased so completely that even its memory was buried under impassable mud. Most ancient myths celebrate endurance, Rome's eternal walls, the phoenix's rebirth, but Atlantis dares us to imagine the opposite. That total loss can be instructive. The philosopher's contemporaries would have recognized this as a jab at Athenian imperialism. Modern audiences, though, hear something different, a siren song whispering that glorious ruins might still be found, if only we look hard enough. Archaeologists have watched this play out in real time. When satellite imagery revealed geometric shapes off Spain's coast in 2011, headlines screamed, "Atlantis found." Despite experts noting the patterns matched natural geology, similarly, when the Richat structure in Mauritania gained online fame as a potential Atlantis site, its eroded rock layers became obvious concentric canals to believers. The myth doesn't just endure, it reprograms how we see the world, turning geological quirks into phantom blueprints. Pop culture turbocharges this effect. From Jules Verne's submarine adventures to Disney's animated utopia, each retelling adds new scaffolding to Plato's sparse description. Marvel's Nama doesn't rule Atlantis, he commands Talokan, a Mesoamerican reinterpretation that swaps Greek columns for stepped pyramids. Even video games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey let players explore the sunken city, blending Plato's original with fantastical tech. With every adaptation, Atlantis becomes less a place and more a Rorschach test, revealing what each era considers the pinnacle of civilization. Or its fatal flaws, the most fascinating twist, Plato might have borrowed the concept from earlier disasters. Santorini's volcanic eruption in 1600 BC obliterated the Minoan city of Akrotiri, preserving vivid frescoes under ash just like Pompeii. Some scholars think Egyptian priests passed down this cataclysm's memory, which Plato then reshaped into his morality tale. If true, Atlantis is itself a recycled myth, a cultural palimpsest where one civilization's trauma became another's cautionary fable. That cyclical nature explains why Atlantis keeps resurfacing in unlikely places. During the space race, astronomers speculated about Martian canals with Atlantean fervor. Today's Silicon Valley billionaires fund ocean exploration not just for science, but chasing that same tantalizing maybe. The myth endures not because we've found evidence, but because we haven't. The void invites projection. Every generation drops its dreams into Plato's sunken vault, and the waters give back whatever we need most. Warnings about climate change, hopes for lost technologies, or simply the thrill that the world might still hold undiscovered wonders. Atlantis' true power isn't in being found, it's in keeping us searching. Climate change didn't invent the flood myth, it just gave it new teeth. From Jakarta's sinking streets to Venice's drowning piazzas, rising waters aren't just headlines, they're resurrecting archetypes buried deep in our cultural DNA. The Gilgamesh epic warned of a deluge wiping out humanity 6,000 years ago. Now, satellite images of melting glaciers feel like cuneiform tablets rewritten in ice. But here's where it gets interesting. Unlike ancient civilizations who mythologized disasters after they struck, we're doing something unprecedented. We're crafting our survival stories in real time, turning scientific projections into collective narratives before the worst even arrives. Take the way wildfires have seeped into modern folklore. California's fire season now carries the same ominous weight as Norse prophecies of Surt's flames consuming the world, yet in the ashes new symbols emerge. The superblooms that explode across charred hillsides have become living metaphors for regeneration, their orange poppies splashed across Instagram like digital cave paintings. Indigenous fire ecologists, long dismissed for their controlled burning practices, are suddenly the wise elders in this new mythos, their traditional knowledge recast as survival lore for the Anthropocene. The pattern mirrors how Maya drought myths guided their descendants through collapse, but with one crucial difference: our stories unfold on smartphones as much as stone. Then there's the curious case of climate grief circles. These grassroots gatherings where strangers share anguish over dying species and rising seas function like secular versions of the Aztec Nemontemi days, those 5 hollow days at the year's end when ordinary time paused and people mourned what was lost. Psychologists note how these rituals borrow from ancient playbooks, giving shape to collective trauma so it becomes bearable, even actionable. A teenager planting a mangrove sapling in Bangladesh isn't just mitigating erosion. She's reenacting the Hindu myth of Shiva replanting the world tree after primordial floods. Corporate jargon reveals the same mythic undercurrents: Silicon Valley's obsession with disruption, and pivots unwittingly channels the Phoenix narrative, the idea that destruction fuels innovation. When Tesla executives talk about accelerating the transition to renewables, they're speaking the language of the Hopi's emergence myth, where each collapsed world births a wiser successor. Even dystopian pop culture, from Mad Max to Station 11, serves as modern-day cautionary tales, rehearsing collapse so we might navigate it better. But the most potent new myths aren't about doom, they're about agency. The Green New Deal isn't just policy, it's a covenant with the future, echoing the mandate of heaven's promise that leadership must align with cosmic balance. Teen activists like Greta Thunberg don't just cite data, they channel Cassandra's warnings and the Norse eagle's cry before Ragnarok. What makes these narratives stick isn't their novelty, but their ancient bones. They remind us that every civilization faces its winters. The question isn't whether we'll tell stories about collapse, but whether we'll be wise enough to plant the seeds of the next spring within them. The Ouroboros doesn't just bite its tail, it swallows time whole. This ancient symbol of a serpent devouring itself appears on Egyptian funerary texts as early as 1400 BC, coiled around the edges of temple walls like a cosmic belt. But it's not merely a decorative loop, it's a radical refusal of finality. When the Gnostics painted the Ouroboros encircling the world, or when alchemists sketched it in the margins of their manuscripts, they weren't doodling. They were encoding a truth that terrified and comforted in equal measure. Nothing truly ends, it just changes shape. What makes this symbol so enduring is its brutal simplicity. Unlike the Phoenix's fiery spectacle or Ragnarok's battle scenes, the Ouroboros reduces eternity to a single gesture, a creature consuming its own body to sustain itself. Egyptian priests saw it as the god Autumn's nightly journey through the underworld, where dissolution and rebirth were two sides of the same scale. The Aztecs echoed this with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who shed his skin to renew the world. Even Nietzsche, that mustachioed prophet of modernity, borrowed the image for his concept of eternal recurrence, the idea that every moment will repeat infinitely. The message is universal. Destruction isn't the opposite of creation, it's its fuel. Archaeologists find Ouroboros motifs in startling places. A Viking arm ring unearthed in Sweden twists into the serpent's form, its jaws clamped where the clasp should be. Chinese jade discs from the Han Dynasty carve the dragon chasing its tail around the perimeter, mirroring the cyclical paths of stars. The symbol's power lies in its adaptability. It's as at home in a medieval alchemy lab as it is on a Silicon Valley executive's tattoo. When Jungian analysts use it to represent the psyche's self-sustaining nature, or when modern physicists invoke it to explain closed time-like curves in space-time, they're proving the Ouroboros never stopped evolving. But here's the twist: the serpent's bite isn't painless. Renaissance alchemists like Michael Mayer depicted the Ouroboros with its body half-digested, a visceral reminder that renewal requires sacrifice. The Aztec version, Zucotl, was set ablaze during ceremonies, a literal burning away of the old to make space for the new. This isn't some sanitized, inspirational poster version of Cycles. It's the acknowledgement that transformation demands surrender. When a startup founder talks about failing forward, or a cancer survivor describes their journey as shedding a skin, they're channeling the same raw truth the Ouroboros has whispered for millennia. The symbol's darkest and most hopeful lesson appears in its medical adoption. The Greek physician Cleopatra not that one used the Ouroboros to represent the endless cycle of disease and healing. Today, it's stamped on ambulances and pharmacy logos worldwide, a reminder that health isn't a static state but a constant rebalancing. In this light, the serpent becomes more than a metaphor, it's a survival strategy. Indigenous healers in the Amazon brew ayahuasca, calling it the serpent medicine, not because it cures, but because it forces the drinker to confront their own tale, the patterns they've been consuming without realizing. Modern artists keep the Ouroboros alive in unexpected ways. A Tokyo subway map redesigned as a serpent swallowing its own stations. A climate change mural in Berlin where the tail is made of melting icebergs, the head of solar panels. Even blockchain enthusiasts tout their immutable ledgers as digital Ouroboros systems that sustain themselves through constant self-consumption. The symbol thrives because it's never been just about circles. It's about the tension at the bite point, that excruciating moment where endings and beginnings share teeth. Perhaps that's why the Ouroboros outlasts empires. It doesn't promise resurrection or revenge, just the quiet, relentless truth that every closure is an opening in disguise. When you stare too long at the serpent's loop, something strange happens. You stop seeing a circle and start noticing the infinite spirals hidden within it. The Maya knew this when they painted their version with stars trailing behind the jaws, proving even the devourer leaves something in its wake. So the next time you face an ending, a relationship, a career, even a civilization, remember the Ouroboros, not as a promise that things will return, but as proof they were never truly gone to begin with. Myths don't just tell stories, they stitch survival instructions into the fabric of a culture's identity, passed down like genetic code through generations. Think of them as ancient software updates, each iteration refining the operating system for resilience. The Aboriginal songlines of Australia, for instance, aren't mere tales. They're navigational maps, survival guides, and legal contracts all woven into one. When an elder sings the path of the rainbow serpent across the land, they're not just preserving a story, they're transmitting millennia of ecological knowledge, teaching how to find water in drought or predict seasonal shifts. This is cultural DNA in action, myths encoding practical wisdom in a form so memorable it outlasts empires. Consider the way the Norse myth of Ragnarok doesn't just depict doom, it programs its audience for adaptability. By rehearsing the end of the world in sagas and carvings, Vikings normalized the idea of collapse, making it less terrifying when harvests failed or chieftains fell. The myth's insistence that two humans would survive to repopulate the earth wasn't fantasy. It was a psychological vaccine against despair. Fast forward to modern Scandinavia, where this same narrative thread appears in their approach to climate change. Sweden's lagom philosophy, finding balance in moderation, echoes the Norse belief that excess leads to destruction, while measured resilience ensures renewal. The myth didn't just survive, it evolved, whispering across centuries that endings are followed by regrowth. But rebirth myths don't just teach survival, they embed ethical frameworks. The Hindu concept of the Yuga cycle, with its 4 repeating ages, doesn't merely predict societal decline. It frames moral decay as a natural phase, like winter before spring, urging adherents to uphold Dharma even when the world seems chaotic. This isn't passive acceptance, it's a call to stewardship. During the Bhakti movement of medieval India, poets invoked the Yuga cycle to critique caste oppression, arguing that the Kali Yuga's darkness could be illuminated by devotion and justice. Here, the myth becomes a tool for social change, its cyclical nature assuring reformers that their efforts weren't futile, just part of a larger turn of the wheel. The most powerful myths operate like time capsules designed to unlock when needed. The Ojibwe legend of the 7 Fires prophecies, a series of visions foretelling colonization, cultural erosion, and eventual revival, wasn't shared widely until the 20th century. Elders had guarded it for generations, waiting for the moment when their people would need its roadmap most. When activists in the 1970s revived language immersion schools and treaty rights movements, they drew directly on these prophecies, which promised that the 7th fire would be lit by rekindling ancestral wisdom. The myth didn't just predict the future, It actively shaped it, providing a script for resistance and rebirth when the time was ripe. What's remarkable is how these stories bypass rational skepticism to speak directly to the subconscious. A child hearing the Phoenix myth doesn't need to believe in magical birds to absorb its core lesson. Destruction can be generative. The Cherokee story of Grandmother Spider stealing fire isn't just entertainment, it's a masterclass in resourcefulness and risk-taking, qualities that sustain the tribe through forced removals and displacement. These narratives work like mental antibodies, priming cultures to recognize patterns, when to resist, when to adapt, when to gather the ashes and begin again. Nowhere is this more evident than in diaspora communities, where myths become lifelines back to identity. The Yoruba descendants in Cuba, separated from their homeland by slavery, preserved the Orisha traditions through coded drumbeats and Catholic saint syncretism. Their stories of Shango's lightning and Oshun's rivers weren't just spiritual practices, they were resistance technologies, ensuring that even in bondage, the cultural operating system could reboot. Today, when a Santeria priest pours honey for Oshun in Havana, they're not just performing a ritual, they're executing ancient code, maintaining a lineage that outlasted ships and chains. This is the ultimate alchemy of rebirth myths. They transform memory into destiny. The Maori story of Maui fishing up islands from the sea isn't just about the past, it's a blueprint for future sovereignty, inspiring land reclamation movements in Aotearoa. The Greek Persephone's annual return from the underworld doesn't just explain seasons, it models how to navigate trauma and re-emerge with strength. These stories don't dwell on endings because they're too busy engineering beginnings. When we tell them today, we're not just keeping the past alive, we're planting seeds for worlds we may never see, but that will remember us in their roots. The Jewish people didn't just survive exile, they mythologized it into a compass. When the Babylonians razed Solomon's temple in 586 BCE and dragged the Israelites into captivity, it could have been the final chapter. Instead, scribes in Babylon began weaving a story so potent, it would outlast every empire that sought to erase them. The Exodus narrative, retold not as a distant memory, but as a living blueprint. Jeremiah's letter to the exiles, build houses and plant gardens, wasn't surrender. It was the first stitch in a cultural safety net stretched across millennia, where myths of exile and return became the threads holding identity together when geography could not. What made these stories revolutionary was their fractal nature. The Passover Seder, developed during the Roman occupation, doesn't merely recount the flight from Egypt. It demands participants taste bitter herbs and charoset, collapsing time so that every generation feels both the sting of slavery and the sweetness of liberation. Archaeologists find echoes of this in diaspora communities from medieval Spain to modern Brooklyn, the same Haggadah texts unearthed in Cairo, Geniza, their margins crammed with notes in Arabic, Ladino, and Yiddish, proving how each retelling adapted to new contexts while preserving core DNA. The myth wasn't a relic, it was a renewable resource. The genius lay in embedding resilience into ritual. When Jews fled the Spanish Inquisition, they carried not just Torah scrolls, but a liturgical calendar synced to Jerusalem's seasons, reciting prayers for rain in Morocco's deserts, as if to say memory could override climate. Kabbalists in Safe transformed exile itself into a cosmic drama, teaching that scattered sparks of divinity needed gathering through daily acts of holiness. This wasn't passive waiting for Messiah's arrival. It was active participation in repair, turning every diaspora kitchen into a workshop for redemption. Even the wandering Jew legend, imposed by medieval Christians as an anti-Semitic trope, was reclaimed. Yiddish folktales recast the eternal traveler as a witness to history, his longevity proof of covenant endurance. During the Holocaust, partisans in Vilna's ghettos staged Purim plays where Haman wore Nazi insignia, weaponizing carnivalesque subversion that traced back to Esther's story of reversal. The myths didn't just comfort, they armed. Modern Israel's rebirth could have rendered exile narratives obsolete. Instead, they evolved. Ethiopian Jews airlifted to Jerusalem in 1991 sang psalms about eagle's wings, mirroring biblical prophecies of return. Soviet refuseniks smuggled microfilmed Torah portions into gulags, treating prison walls as just another pharaoh's obstacle. Even secular Israelis debating borders today invoke Joshua's tribal allocations and David's United Kingdom, not as literal maps, but as proof that home is a story before it's a place. The lesson isn't just about cultural survival. It's about narrative alchemy, how a people turn displacement into a generative force. Like the Midrashic tradition of arguing with sacred texts, Jewish exile myths thrive on tension, longing for Zion while blooming where planted, mourning lost temples while making dining tables altars. Archaeologists may someday sift through our era's artifacts, Zoom Seda recordings, Ukrainian refugees clutching Haggadahs, and recognize the same pattern. A civilization that mastered the art of packing light in material terms but carrying infinite worlds in its words. The Firebird doesn't just glow, it turns darkness into a canvas. In Slavic folklore, this radiant creature isn't merely a symbol of rebirth like its phoenix cousin. It's a celestial GPS for lost souls navigating collapse. Picture a peasant stumbling through a winter forest, the kind where trees creak like old bones and the wind steals breath. Suddenly, a single feather falls, pulsing with light strong enough to reveal hidden paths in the snow. That's the Firebird's real magic, not just its ability to rise from ashes, but its power to make the unbearable journey visible. Unlike Western myths where renewal often follows cataclysm, Slavic traditions embed guidance within the crisis itself. The Firebird appears mid-struggle in most tales, perched on Tsar Ivan's windowsill as his kingdom teeters toward rebellion, or dazzling Prince Ivan mid-battle when his sword arm falters. Its light doesn't promise immediate salvation, it illuminates the next step. Folklorists trace this to ancient harvest rituals where torches were carried through fields, not to banish winter, but to show where to plant when spring came. The Firebird's glow works the same way. It doesn't negate the night, it reveals the tools hidden within it. Consider Vasilisa the Beautiful story, where a Firebird skull lantern, yes, Slavic tales get visceral, guides her through Baba Yaga's trials. The light doesn't shield her from the witch's hunger or the impossible tasks. It helps her see the spinning wheel's rhythm in the chaos, to notice the right grains hidden in piles of chaff. Modern psychologists might call this locus of control training. The Firebird teaches that collapse isn't something endured passively. It's navigated actively, one illuminated choice at a time. The bird's connection to celestial cycles deepens the metaphor. In Ukrainian embroidery patterns, Firebird motifs often cluster near solar symbols, their threads mirroring the sun's path across the sky. Belarusian folk songs describe its wings stirring the Milky Way, scattering stardust that becomes morning dew. This isn't just pretty imagery, it roots renewal in cosmic inevitability. When Polish rebels during the partition sewed Firebirds onto their banners, they weren't just invoking beauty, they were declaring that empires, like knights, have fixed durations. What makes the Firebird uniquely Slavic is its relationship with thieves. Half the tales feature someone, a prince, a cunning peasant, stealing its feathers or golden apples. Far from condemning this, the stories celebrate it as necessary audacity. The message, renewal, isn't a gift bestowed. It's seized by those brave enough to reach into the fire. Serbian epics take it further. The Firebird sometimes allows itself to be caught, like a muse choosing who gets inspiration. Today, you'll spot its legacy in unexpected places. Chernobyl's liquidators adopted the Firebird as an unofficial emblem, its light symbolizing their fight to contain invisible danger. Ukrainian tech startups use its image for AI projects that illuminate day to dark matter. Even the protests in Belarus saw women weaving Firebird motifs into their resistance embroidery. The myth persists not because it promises happy endings, but because it trains the eye to spot embers in the ashes and the courage to fan them. From phoenixes to firebirds, myths have always turned endings into beginnings. They remind us that collapse isn't oblivion, it's transformation. As we face modern challenges, these ancient narratives offer timeless wisdom. The end is never the end. What myths will we create to carry us forward? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the power of story. But here's the thing about myths: they're not just stories we tell. They're stories that tell us. They shape how we see the world, how we respond to crisis, and most importantly, how we imagine what comes next. Think about the way climate activists today speak of regeneration rather than doom, framing melting glaciers as a call to action rather than a funeral dirge. That's the phoenix impulse, alive and well, refusing to let despair have the final word. Or consider how tech pioneers talk about failing fast and iterating, echoing the Maya's belief that creation is a series of attempts, each collapse a lesson carved into the next cycle. These ancient blueprints for renewal aren't locked in the past. They're evolving in real time, adapting to our digital age with surprising urgency. When a community crowdsources disaster relief after a hurricane, they're channeling the same collective resilience as the Norse survivors of Ragnarok. When a scientist stores endangered seeds in a vault beneath the Arctic ice, they're performing a modern version of the Hopi migration myths, packing wisdom for the next emergence. Even memes, those fleeting fragments of internet culture, can function like micro-myths, distilling complex truths into shareable symbols that outlast their moment. The question isn't whether we'll create new myths, but whether we'll do it consciously. Will we default to dystopian tales of helplessness, or will we craft narratives that empower? The difference matters. After all, the stories we tell today are the survival tools of tomorrow. They'll be whispered in bunkers and coded into algorithms, painted on protest signs and woven into lullabies. They'll determine whether our grandchildren see an ending or an invitation. So as we click off this video, let's carry forward the oldest lesson of all. Every apocalypse is also a genesis. The phoenix doesn't rise in spite of the flames, it rises because of them. Now it's your turn. What stories will you plant in the cracks of this crumbling world? Drop them in the comments like seeds, and let's see what grows. And if you've enjoyed this dive into the alchemy of myth, hit subscribe. The next chapter is always just